Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Octopus Movement podcast, where we celebrate the extraordinary multipotentiality of nonlinear thinkers and their undeniable impact on the world. I'm your host, Aiden Gillen-Bronze, and today I have the pleasure of being joined by Anshar Seraphim, who is a high-stakes negotiation trainer and applied behavioral psychologist, and also founding member of the Octopus Movement. Uh, as a founding member, his tentacular suckers are all over our group's powerful vision: linear meets non-linear, the human mycelium grows, unsolvable solved, and sustainable future blooms. If you're looking to get the best price for your ring, with his experience in both the jewelry industry and working with sex workers in the Pacific Northwest, Anshar is the perfect person to be able to guide you to achieve exactly that. Anshar, when did it first occur to you that you might be a non-linear thinker?
Well, I was 75% nonverbal with autism at age 11, and I had a lot of challenges in that venue. I didn't really have my first real friend for doing more than just like a shared activity with someone until I was about 25 years old. So I didn't actually get my autism diagnosis until I was 19 years old, and I tried to join the U.S. military because I kind of came from that generation before we were passing out diagnoses like slips of paper. So I had to really pivot in my life. I used to walk around with my arms crossed, looking at the ground. Wasn't able to give people facial expressions or change the tone of my voice. So I had a lot of challenges to overcome just to be able to interact with people. And so I had to put a lot of work into that. For a long time, I was just working in information technology because it felt safe to just be behind a desk. And like many autistic young adults, I didn't drive. Lots of different challenges, sensory processing disorder. I didn't actually get my driver's license until I was 37. It was a big accomplishment for me. So I always felt like I thought differently from everyone around me. It was kind of obvious. But I had so many other things in my way that I needed to get the exposure to other people to really know for sure that I actually was thinking in a different way than them because I wasn't able to compare ideas. So, um, but once I kind of came into my own and I went down that process, down that rabbit hole, because by the time I'd gone to about 25, I'd had like 50 autistic special interests. And so after getting really socially frustrated, I just kind of asked myself an interesting question, which was, what would happen if I made the brain and psychology into an autistic special interest? How would that guide my journey, my evolution? And it changed everything. So, here I am, 20 years later, and now, if you would have told me 20 years ago I'd be teaching people communication skills or, how to apply psychological or psychosocial dynamics in the way that they interact with people, I would have said you were crazy. But having to go through that journey made me kind of mince everything up into tiny little pieces to figure it out for myself. And oddly enough, that made it really easy to transmit to others. So that was something I was able to take away from that.
And how did you find that first initial realization that you suspected that your thinking process was different, but how did you, when you realized that it was, what was that realization like for you? Was it an aha moment or a moment of panic?
Um, so one of the cool things that I did to try to expose myself to other people when I was in college is I went ahead and started becoming an academic tutor. And it was a smaller satellite campus of Sierra College. So there was like a student body, like 600 students. And I was the only academic tutor at an entire college campus, working in the library and resource center and doing, the writing center and taking care of all that, helping people with drafting and all of that. And when people started to actually explain their thought processes and were trying to explain their work to me, it was so strange to see how differently everyone felt and thought from the way that I did. I'd been learning for a long time how to try to integrate with other people, but when I started comparing ideas, especially when I got into mathematics, um, just if you take a simple like 2-digit by 2-digit multiplication problem and you give it to 50 different people, they'll all actually do the problem slightly differently. And it's interesting, even if we're all taught a particular method for something, but for me, I would do it completely different than everybody else. And one of the reasons was, and I didn't know this, I mean, when you don't talk to other people, you don't know, but as I have synesthesia. And so, you know, there's all kinds of different ways that affects me with my sensory processing disorder and all of that. But one of those things is that when I see numbers or concepts, sometimes they actually fit into shapes and colors in my head. So just my basic way of kind of cogitating on concepts or being able to think of how things interact, it was very nonlinear. But I didn't know that it was nonlinear until I had the ability to check my work against other people, and then I had to go through the frustration of setting up meetings with my professors to try to explain, what the heck, you got the right answer, but how did you get there? Because I just, they couldn't follow me. So I think that's what kind of gave me some insight that maybe I was even a little more different on the inside, because I thought that maybe it was just the social challenges, but that was just the tip of the iceberg.
Fair enough. So how did you get from that realization then that you have got a very different way of experience of thinking, your thought process are very different, it's intermingled with synesthesia. Okay, so you're very different. How did you then manage to leverage that difference and really turn it to your advantage from being socially isolated to being fully socially integrated and teaching communication skills?
Failure, I think failure is exciting, and it's not always that way, but we do this weird thing, because when we watch like a little kid stumbling, learning how to walk, we'll smile to ourselves when they go through that process because we know what's at the end of it. But there's this kind of liminal phase that we go through, and then we go into adulthood where we start thinking about failure very differently. And
Yeah.
instead of being the thing that's absolutely necessary for success, we start to denigrate failure and look down on people who fail. And there's not a person out there who acquired a skill without failing to acquire it. So it's kind of funny that we do that as a culture. But I started to take more pride in my failure. I learned a way it didn't work. Like when I was first starting to try to integrate with people socially, I did
Mm.
what a lot of neurodivergent people do. I tried to mask and try to be more and more like neurotypical people, kind of put on my little anthropologist pith helmet and go and see how the normal people are, normal. And going through that process, I got really, really good at it, only to realize that it was exactly the opposite of what I actually wanted. That that when you pretend to be someone that you're not, you create some very basic problems. The first is that you don't prepare people for who you are. So even if
Mm.
99.9% of the time, you're flexing and trying to hold some type of artificial persona, then that one moment that you slip up is taken in the worst way possible. I think it's only 2.5% of people with Tourette's actually swear, but just for the sake of argument, if you're on a first date or something and you manage to go through the whole dinner and you don't have something happen, and then at the very end something happens, it's going to be taken in the worst way possible because you haven't prepared that person. So I had to learn
Mm.
to advocate for myself, learn to positively share my challenges, let people know what was going on with me, and share that in an uplifting way, and then move right on past it. And being able to take accountability in that way was really great. But the other thing I learned about masking, and why that failure was so impactful, is that I wanted to escape that isolation chamber of my neurodivergence. And
Mm.
when you lie about who you are, even if you get everything that you want, then you start to get that imposter syndrome because you'll secretly believe that if they knew who you really were, that you wouldn't be worth that love or attention or gratification or any of that. So I had to kind of defeat myself a few times. But in conquering that, in learning from those failures, that was what showed me, why I had to construct a different path. And I had to be willing to put myself into challenging situations to do it. And that was a huge opportunity for growth for me.
So then just going, then that takes us nicely to the title of this podcast in terms of what's our problem with autism. What is people's problem with autism? Why is it so difficult walking that initial journey as a person with autism?
Well, I think one problem is just in the fact that we use words. When we get into semiotics and we get into the way that people feel about words, get into the semantics of words, and it's
Mm.
um, when a person has autism, there's a reason that they call it a spectrum. You can have what like up to a 60% comorbidity with ADHD. So that's one flavor. Some autistic people have a really big, tough challenge with sensory processing disorder. I did, especially with synesthesia. Then you have other people who have a cognitive impairments, intellectual impairments, other comorbid conditions. The spectrum of challenges. I'm happy to say right now that I have low support needs as an autistic adult, but that wasn't always the case. And when you just tell a person that you're autistic, um, what you've really done at that point is just encourage them to use whatever they know about autism and then to put that on you as an effigy. And that doesn't really help people know who you are or how to treat you. And so
Mm.
the problem with labels, when it comes to diagnostic criteria or getting someone on an insurance plan or something like that, there are uses to labels. But at the same time, um, it also kind of lets you cop out of that whole process of self-advocating and talking about what it is that's different about you as an individual. And I think that, so the first problem is in using labels to identify, because when you do that, you've really done yourself and the other person a disservice. But another problem is that unless someone has someone who's actually autistic in their lives, they don't know what it looks like. And it's so funny to me, after having to just struggle and fail and all of that for 25 years, um, to have people come up to me and say things like, "You're not autistic," and at the same time, it's like, okay, well, I mean, I put a whole bunch of work in. If you'd have known me 10 years ago, I was literally looking down at the ground while I was talking with no facial expressions and in
Sure.
monotone. But in a way, when a disability is invisible to the naked eye, people treat you differently. There's a tendency in the human brain, especially as people know you for longer, like family members, friends, where your symptoms will be treated as character traits. Because if you had a friend that was in a wheelchair, let's say, you wouldn't think less of them for not offering to help you move. But if you have a friend with ADHD and they forget your birthday, or they're sparked by something that you say and they change the top and it sounds like they're talking about themselves, there is a tendency to socially judge those behaviors in the context of if a person was neurotypical. And by not positively advocating, by not self-advocating and talking about that, and it doesn't open up a discussion. I don't know if you've ever been around a person with physical disfigurements, but the social reaction is either, once the intimacy barrier is crossed, to start asking a whole bunch of questions to be able to figure out how to treat that person. But every person who doesn't do that, when that person doesn't self-advocate, is either going to stare at you or avert their gaze. And that's kind of what happens with neurodivergence too. And there's a lack of understanding there, and it makes all kinds of different situations frustrating, because when you process the world differently, people assume that your reactions are for completely different reasons because they assume it as if it was them. That's the classic human mistake, is to project ourselves onto others.
So how can we overcome that then as neurodivergent people? For example, in the workplace, where we strive for inclusive and full inclusion, and I've said this before, but everyone, inclusion is like a sense of humor or being a good kisser. Everyone thinks that they do it, but very few people actually do it very well. And so how do we cross that barrier? How do we get neurotypical people to understand that there's a whole different way of experiencing the workplace, and that's not going to change? And it's not about trying to make neurodivergent people more neurotypical, but about meeting neurodivergent people where they are. It sounds like you've done that before. So how would you advise people to do that?
Well, the problem is that when we're young, we try on different social roles. It's how we explore who we are. And how we treat people that are different than us speaks a lot to, who we eventually become as people. And there's not enough focus when we're younger. If I solve a problem differently, or I have a different way of looking at an answer, or I have different ways of interacting socially, or different things that are important to me. And when we have adults around us as children, if they're not fostering an environment that forces kids to look at that differently, then the problem is then you grow up an entire generation of people who negatively social evaluate each other for the hierarchy. You have hegemonic and counter hegemonic ideas with everything else that's going on in the world. And by the time that you get there, you know then it becomes, especially as we get into like larger classroom sizes and then large corporations and stuff like that, it can be so difficult going from like an industrial organizational psychological aspect to get 50 people running in the same direction, as if you're in human resources, you're in the training department, or if you're in education. And there's so much effort to do that, that when a person does things differently, it's not that that if you were to stop that person and ask them if uniformity and lack of individuality was the goal. But if you tried to ask yourself the reverse question, what would you have to do culturally with kids and in the workplace to punish individuality and stifle creativity and stifle different ways of doing things? And if you made a list brainstorming in the negative direction, you would see that many of the things that were on your list are things that we already do all the time and don't even think about the negative ramifications of those. So the real question is not how can we foster a neuro inclusive, or just simply an inclusive environment, but how can we create a cultural value as a society at a much younger level? Because if all you have to do is talk to a person who's 70, 80, 90 years old, And they're going to carry those cultural and social values with them that they learned when they were young with them to the end of their days.
I hear that, and I appreciate all of that as valid, but it's not much help to somebody in the workplace at the moment. For example, what could somebody do today if they were really feeling misunderstood?
Well, the
And
reason that I say that is that in some ways you have to kind of regress a little bit because, for instance, when I was a kid, when we started to have some kids with disabilities at a school, and I was in a smaller classroom size,
mm,
they did an activity where they put like some beer goggles on us and they put some headphones on us where they turned up the volume too high, and
mm,
some of us they gave like a scratchy wool sweater, and then they tried to teach class. And all of a sudden, every single kid in that room was fidgeting and itching and moving around and trying to do something else and was trying to cover their ears. And everyone was complaining about the lights being too bright.
yeah,
When other people get to have relatable experiences that actually teach them what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes, you don't have to teach people to be considerate and empathetic. You just have to
sure,
teach them to be aware of why they should. And if we could change that, but then the other challenge falls on the opposite side of the table, and that's that people who are neurodiverse have grown up in an environment that's antagonistic to us. And
mm,
so we've learned to be defensive. We've learned to undershare. We've learned to try to blend in. And so our part of the social equation is very simply to self advocate and talk about what's different about us in a positive, uplifting way. And then create the onus of expectation that people listen to us and then out of good faith try to integrate that. It requires both parties meeting at the table. And I think we just right now we're taking a lot of turns is the problem.
sure. Um, no, that sounds that definitely is an important dialogue to have. I suppose my reservation as a neurodivergent person would be, I suppose I'm mindful of that Japanese proverb about the nail that stands out the tallest is the one that gets hit with the hammer first. You don't want to be that person in the who's so self-advocating to such an extent that it's all you talk about almost, and you almost become identified or as a trope of your neurodivergence. I think it's difficult. I think the workplace is a difficult place to get the balance right because it does require such cultural change, as you've noticed. Um, uh, Absolutely. Um, where have we gone to? We've got so you've managed very well to bridge the gap between linear and non-linear thinkers, and you're helping linear thinkers think more non-linearly about how our world is. But how did these connections that you've built and how do they feed into our human mycelium and our kind of the octopus of the vision for building our growing our human mycelium that is more interconnected and built on better understanding?
So I think that one of the first goals is being a good listener. If you want to get into a group of nonlinear thinkers and try and take all of their ideas and put them together in a way that other people are able to understand, the communication skills are key, first off. But I think that listening is a lost art. We're all
Mm,
taught these things that people talked about in the 80s, all the nodding and the follow-up questions and stuff. But your real goal as a critical listener isn't to do that for validation, but the goal should be to follow another person's work to see how they got where they are, so that if when they're done speaking, you can actually follow their work and show them that how you understand how they got to the place that they did. And when a person feels validated in that way, they won't have anything left to say. They're no longer arguing a point. And being able to connect linear and nonlinear or multiple nonlinear people is about making sure that you have an understanding of all of those messages, all of those voices before, because I think wasn't it Aristotle who said that that the mark of a thinker is being able to hold an idea in your head, whether or not you agree with it or not. The
mm.
idea that you can entertain all of these different ideas and understand how people showed their work to get there, whether or not you agree with them, so that you can have a more holistic view. And the truth of it is that sometimes the nonlinear solution isn't going to be as good as the linear solution. And this is one of the frustrations when we get into psychometrics, when we're talking about, measuring intelligence or talking about IQ. Because if I give you a math problem and I'm given a math problem, my nonlinear brain might do that problem a completely different way as a first approach, even if we've both been taught a single approach. And if my nonlinear approach happens to take longer, and your linear approach happens to take less time, or vice versa, one of us is going to perform better on that particular question. And it's all in how you measure, and that's
Mm.
why I use the example when we were, I was trying to amalgamate the ideas from the think tank on rethinking intelligence about the movie Slumdog Millionaire, because that person led
Mhm.
a life, he got exposed to certain information, and as a result of getting exposed to that information, because of the questions he was asked, he looked like a freaking genius. If you'd asked him different questions, he might not have had the answers. So I think that our exposure to different ways of thinking also helps us grow as people. And I think that's one of the things that I love the most about the Octopus movement, is that you get to meet all of these people who have a completely different way of doing things. And if you can learn enough about everyone's approach, then you start in your own way to be able to synthesize a new way of thinking, and your way of thinking continues to evolve and grow. It reminds me of the penny universities from the 18th century. You would go and buy a cup of tea or coffee and sit down and get exposed to all these great ideas. I mean, that's how we got the building blocks up to Newton being able to unify gravity and stuff. So I think that the exchange of ideas is so important, but for us to be able to do that, we have to have respect for one another. And one of the problems about the egocentrism of the modern, iteration of the social culture is that
Mm.
we tend to think of, being online as a social and a fun space and a productive space. And so our psychological modality and looking at that space in that way, especially as a way of being able to feed our own egos and get validation and seek dopamine, it encourages us when someone disagrees with us to just hit the ignore button. Then we don't have to deal with that person in our space. And it's a marked difference from just 50 years ago when you listened to the radio and people
Mm.
enjoyed talking about their ideas, enjoyed disagreeing with one another. Well, that's not my opinion, but I respect you, and you don't hear that anymore. That dialogue has gone away. And if we can't talk to one another, we sure as hell can't make it better.
No, that's true. And when I was working in higher education, I used to have to advise people that the days of coming to university to have a good old think about things just because you're interested in them, those days have really gone. It's too expensive now, and it's kind of, unfortunately, it's those kind of, everyone's sitting around and having a good old think about things. It's just no longer the case. It's a much more functional, practical environment these days. I was going to ask you a question there about egocentrism and personality, and touching just a little bit on Slumdog Millionaire, and I highly recommend the book Q&A by Vikram Seth that was based on, which is much better than the film. But it's the same theme. How much of personality do you think is predestined? How much do you think is the role of destiny in personality development, either not in who you are, but in maybe who you become?
Speaking from a psychological perspective, psychologists, debate on this, but up to 75% of personality and affects are genetic. But honestly, we're 99 over 99% chimpanzee too. So, which percentage of, nature versus nurture, I think is unimportant. I think it's all about because I guess the easiest way that I could describe it to you would be, if you had one person who grew up being abused by, an abusive family, abusive father, and had a horrible experience, ended up being homeless, and a bunch of negative things happen to that person could make the choice to continue that cycle, or that person could use those experiences as an inspiration for what they don't want to become. And it comes down to, in my opinion, the ability to be self-aware. And because self-awareness, it comes at a price, and that's personal challenge and the agony of, that existential angst. But at the same time, when you take the reins in your own hands and you're no longer just reacting, because the problem with people who are just their reactions is that they're only as reliable, trustworthy, and able to develop as their environment allows for them. And the difference is that when you're willing to expose yourself to challenge because you know that you can survive challenge, is that you will willingly expose yourself to challenge to grow. And I think that's a primary difference in mindset. But there are also some correlations in the brain to things like the ability to resist impulses and that. And again, just because you have that as a psychological modality based on your genetics or based on your neurophysiology doesn't mean that you can't escape that chamber. It just means that that journey might be harder. But in the process of winning that victory, if it is a hard victory, then think of how much easier everything else will be in comparison. And I think that's what's great about experiencing people who have overcome challenge, is that they take a lot more ownership over who they are and who they become. I know what my nature is, but who do I choose to be? Kind of it's a video game reference, but if you go to Skyrim, Parthenax the dragon on top of the mountain, is it better to to be born good and to choose good because you know nothing else, or is it better to be born evil and to choose good through great effort? And I think that life is a choice of great effort, and how authentically you take that choice decides your success.
Well, fair enough. And I suppose that answers our question as to how we can build a sustainable future by being more resilient and thriving future for humanity. So, Anshar, what practical steps can the listeners take away from this episode of the podcast to embrace their own non-linearity, and how can they, really step into that non-linearity and multipotentiality in a positive way, as you have done?
I think that the easiest thing to do would just be to do something simple, because if you don't do something simple, people won't act on it. So I would challenge something that we've all been taught, which is the golden rule, right? Treat other people the way that you want to be treated. But really, that only works when you don't know someone. It's a good ethical guideline for treating a stranger as best as you can. But when you really choose to get to know someone, upgrade it to the platinum rule. Treat other people the way they want to be treated. Find out enough about that person so that you can understand what's different about them and how you would have to change the way that you would normally treat yourself in order to treat them well. And if you can start challenging yourself and your interactions in that way, you will raise the value of your own life and your social connections, but also the value and connections with other people, and enrich their lives too. And life is a process of enrichment. So if you want something simple to do that. Take the people that are closest in your circle and use the platinum rule. And just that should start you on a journey of 1,000 leagues with a single step.
Okay, that's not a recipe for narcissistic abuse victimhood, is it? But just making sure. No, I'm sure it's not. No, that's fine. Thank you very much.
The reciprocity dictates that they have to be able to do the same to you. And when people aren't willing to step outside of themselves and just want to project their own ego on you, and you're taking the effort to treat them the way that they want to be treated, but they're not doing the same to you, then you know that you're around the wrong people.
Yes, well, indeed. So there is the fail-safe, the safety cap on that. No, absolutely. That concludes our exciting episode of the Octopus podcast. Thank you so much to Anshar Seraphim for joining us and sharing your wisdom, experiences, and passion for the nonlinear revolution. Anshar, how can listeners get in touch with you if they want to ask any questions about this or any of the other areas of expertise that you bring to the table?
I already provided a link to my electronic business card, also the various ways to contact me, and you can also find that information on my LinkedIn profile.
Thank you very much. And listeners, if you have any questions about how you can join the movement, feel free to reach out to me via LinkedIn or visit theoctopusmovement.org for full information. Remember, every mind has the potential to be an octopus mind, and so embrace your unique way of thinking, join the movement, and let's bloom a sustainable future together. This is Aiden Gillen-Bronze, and this, signing off until next time. The podcast is available every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and I'll be back with you on the second Friday of next month. Thank you very much.